Good afternoon. My name is Howard Marquez. I'm a professor of pediatrics here, and I direct the Center for the History of Medicine at the University of Michigan Medical School. I'm absolutely delighted and honored to introduce today's keynote speaker, Andrew Sullivan. But before I do that, I'd like to let you in on a not-so-little secret, although I suspect it's already quite well known to most of the people sitting in this room. Throughout the history of medicine, the very best books about the experience of illness have only occasionally been written by those who we honor with the title doctor. From the days of Hippocrates right up to the present, the most compelling and literate accounts of how our bodies and minds respond to disease have more often been produced by writers who are able to wield a pen as skillfully as a surgeon handles a scalpel. Sadly, these two worlds, the world of medicine and healthcare, a world that many of us in this room inhabit, and the world of literature, do not intersect as often as they should. This is most odd, since everyone, regardless of their occupation, be they authors or bricklayers, will eventually experience serious illness, not to mention witness such travails in those they love. Yet while the worlds of literature and medicine employ very different tools in their daily tasks, it is important to recall that their ultimate aim is rather similar: to explain the human condition and to make it more meaningful and better. Andrew Sullivan, a highly regarded novelist and journalist, took as his literary quarry the topic of depression. Initially born out of his own experiences with a devastating illness we are only beginning to understand and ameliorate, he began writing about this topic first for the New Yorker and New York Times magazines, among other leading publications. In 2001, he produced his breathtaking and remarkable book, The Noonday Demon, an Atlas of Depression. Critically acclaimed by all who read it, the book won the National Book Award in 2001. Throughout its richly written pages, Sullivan takes us on a harrowing personal journey of his own experiences with depression, a tour of the malady throughout history, and our plans for its treatment in the future. It is a beautiful blend of insight and science, metaphor and experience, all held together with a palpable warmth, humanity, and sense of hope. The subtitle, An Atlas of Depression, is most apt, not only because the book provides an intricate roadmap to a land many have difficulty understanding, let alone navigating, but also because it has real medical historical roots. The former medical students sitting in this room will likely recall long nights poring over their anatomy texts during their first days of medical school, large picture books which were always reverentially referred to as anatomy atlases. Indeed, this term dates back to the landmark study De Fabrica Humani Corporis by Andreas Vesalius. Vesalius was perhaps the world's first full-time paid medical scientist, and he produced the first reliable atlas of the structure and anatomy of the human body in 1543. No longer, after publication of this book, were physicians content to guess what lay beneath the skin. No longer could they rely on conjectures of the ancients. They now had a roadmap from which all medical science was to take as its starting point. Mr. Sullivan has written a monumental book that allows us all to begin to explore the depths of depression as an illness and to begin removing layer by layer its shroud of stigma and mystery. The medical profession and our patients alike need explorers like Andrew Sullivan, who can both create art out of their life experiences and manage to teach us something into the bargain. We have much to gain if we listen carefully and act decidedly. Hence, you can see why it gives me so much pleasure to welcome to the podium Mr. Andrew Sullivan.
Thank you so much. Splendid introduction. Thank you all for coming, and many thanks to the University of Michigan for having me here today. I actually had a rather curious experience yesterday, which is that I received a phone call from a major national newspaper, pointed out that it was the 50th anniversary of Stalin's death. And they said, "Do you think Stalin's problem was really depression?" I said I thought Stalin's problem was really something else, though he did show some paranoid symptoms. This is my second appearance at a university this week, and it's actually quite a different one. on Sunday, I was asked by one of the senior societies at Yale to come up and speak to a group of students in a rather informal way. The society had just 24 students in it. And I went up rather interested to have this experience and met them all, and they all seemed terribly nice. And I kept thinking, why did they invite me to come and speak to them? And later on in the evening, we had our sort of talk, and as I say, all quite informal. And then I said to them, how many of you have actually had any experience of depression? And there was a sort of nervous giggle for a moment, and then one person raised her hand, and then someone else raised his hand. And eventually 2/3 of them raised their hands, and as one of them said, the other third were lying. These were students at, obviously, a preeminent university, but they were also, in this particular society, the most successful, most accomplished students at that university, and to some extent the most popular students at that university as well. And so the fact that so many of them had depression, I think, points to the scale of the problem of depression on college campuses. Now, I thought back to the times when I was involved in similar societies as a student, and two things are true. One is that nobody recognized that what they had was depression, and two was that nobody would raise their hand in a setting with their peers and actually talk about it. So on the one hand, there's been this sort of terrible slippage into depression and depression recognition, but on the other hand, this splendid openness, which I think is just beginning on college campuses, and there's certainly a long way to go, but which does represent a major step forward. I wrote my book really for a couple of reasons. The first is that there seemed to me to be a popular perception that depression is a modern, Western, middle-class illness. And I wanted to make the point clearly and specifically that that's not the case, that it's existed across history, that it exists across cultures, and that it exists across classes. The other reason, which wasn't clear to me when I began, but became clear as I went through the writing process, is that some people, it seems, have relatively minor depression and have symptoms which, as described, sound not terribly serious, and yet they nonetheless have lives completely overwhelmed by the fact of that depression. And when you say to them, "Who are you?" the answer is, "I am a person with depression." While other people have what appear to be much more serious episodes, and possibly more frequent ones, and seem to have essentially worse cases of depression, but are nonetheless able to live relatively rich and meaningful and rewarding lives in the interstices between those episodes. And I wanted to understand really what the relationship is between illness and personality. And in trying to understand that relationship, to see why some people are able so much better to incorporate the experience of depression into their own lives. So that became the great quest of the book. I'll begin by describing a bit about my own depression, simply because I think so many people in the medical field who treat depression have not had the rare and special privilege of suffering from depression. And there can therefore be some slight confusion as to what the experience really is. And I always say that the opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. And that the experience of depression is not so much one of feeling incredibly sad as one of feeling incredibly devitalized, not having any of the essential energy which constitutes being alive, or any of the powerful feelings which are part of our ordinary day-to-day experience. And so I can say that I'd had a sad episode in my life, which was that my mother died rather dramatically. But after that happened, I didn't feel enormous mourning. I felt some, but I began to feel a kind of creeping numbness. And this numbness kind of gradually came over me, and I found myself caring less and less about what was happening to me and around me. And then after the numbness came a period of difficulty. And this, again, I think is a hallmark of depression. Everything began to seem so effortful. And so the idea that in order to eat, one had to get the food out of the refrigerator and put it on a plate and cut it up and lift it to one's mouth and chew it and swallow it. It all just seemed incredibly difficult. And I couldn't think how everyone else managed to get through all of these steps. But at the same time, and I think this is often left out of discussions of depression, I knew that what was happening to me was ludicrous. I knew that people sat down at the table and ate dinner every day, most people sit down at the table and eat dinner, and that for them it was not an enormous struggle. And so this sense of difficulty was not only painful, but also seemed to me to indicate that I was falling apart, and it undermined my most fundamental sense of myself. And so I went through that, and then there was just an experience of a kind of null pain, just a constant feeling of pain, not sadness really, but just an aching through all experience. And then the anxiety began. Anxiety and depression are, of course, very closely related, and in fact there's been some very strong work on that subject here at the University of Michigan. But they're related both experientially and in biochemical terms. And so most depression incorporates anxiety, and most anxiety incorporates depression. Now, I would say if you said to me, you have to be depressed until April 1st, I would say, well, I really don't want to be, but if it's just until April 1st, I guess I'll put up with that. But if you said to me, you have to be acutely anxious until April 1st, I would say, this is not happening. This is not acceptable. The anxiety is this constant feeling of absolute terror without any object, so that you feel terribly, desperately afraid. You don't know what you're afraid of. You don't know how to mitigate that fear or how to relieve it, and it doesn't appear to have any alleviation in store. Ordinarily, when one is afraid of something, one imagines a point at which one will stop being afraid. But this was a kind of constant, penetrating fear, and it got worse and worse until I finally reached the point at which I simply couldn't move. And there was one day when I woke up, and I thought perhaps I'd had a stroke because I felt so paralyzed. And I thought, I have to call and get help, and I lay and stared at the telephone for 6 hours until fortunately it rang, and I managed to answer it, and I said, something has gone seriously awry. In writing this book about depression, I wanted to get away from what seemed to me to be the three modes of writing about depression, one of which is self-help books written in that sort of slightly obnoxious self-help vocabulary, and one of which is personal memoirs that frequently have little to do with anyone except the person whose memoir it is, and the other are medical texts which I was not qualified to write, but which also are frequently distant from the actual experience of depression. And so I felt the object of this book was not so much to break completely fresh ground as to synthesize these different ways of thinking about things. And the way in which I most specifically wanted to get away from the self-help vocabulary is that self-help books are written always about typical people. Mary had been feeling blue for some day. And I think there are two problems with this, one of which is that there are no typical people, and the other one is that they're incredibly boring. And so I wanted instead to try to write about remarkable people and remarkable experiences, because I thought those would be more useful, more inspiring, more interesting. Since this is a talk about depression on college campuses, I'm going to read to you a couple of brief descriptions of depression that were given to me by people either who were students or related to their student days. The first one is someone called Bill Stein, who was describing his experience actually at an Ivy League school on the East Coast, and who really fell apart and took many years fully to recover. But he said he had been fine through high school, and then he got to college. I had this sadistic roommate, and the academic pressure was intense. I was so anxious I was hyperventilating. I just couldn't take the pressure. So I went to the undergraduate health services, and they gave me Valium. Often when I had deep depression, the control of my bowels would go. I remember that summer was particularly severe in this way. I was dreading sophomore year. I couldn't face my exams or anything. In the end, I withdrew from my aspirations. If you had told me then that I would ultimately be able to return to them, I'd have been utterly shocked. At the time, I was ambitionless. I don't know why I even bothered going to school, and I left a failure. I lost a lot of weight. I had another depression as soon as I graduated. And this is someone who since had really extraordinary accomplishments, but that feeling of falling apart and that feeling of not having other people understand what was happening to him. In his instance, the very medical faculties he spoke to didn't understand it. But I think also that depression on college campuses is particularly difficult because you don't have lots of other people who've had your experience. And so if you get depressed when you're 50 and you tell people you're depressed, lots of people will say, oh, I went through that, and this is how I dealt with it. In college, it happens to you, and you feel completely isolated and alone because it hasn't happened to as many people yet, and because there isn't as much openness about it. I'll read to you about one more person briefly. She's someone who was a sophomore, and she said, "I would get up in the middle of the night and go into the bathroom and study, which everybody thought was extremely odd. People would knock on the door and wonder what I was doing in there. I'd say, 'I'm just studying.' They'd ask, 'Why are you studying in there?' And I'd say, 'I feel like it, you know.' And then they'd say, 'Why don't you go to the common room?' But if I went in there, I might have had to interact with someone. That's what I was avoiding. I would have 7 or 9 chocolate bars a day because that was enough so that I never had to go to the dining hall. If I had gone to the dining hall, people would have said, 'How are you?' And that was the last question I ever wanted to answer. If I kept working and finished the year because I kept working and finished the year because I was more invisible if I just kept showing up. If I'd stayed in bed, the school would call my parents and I'd have had to explain, and I couldn't cope with the visibility, the vulnerability of that. I didn't even think of calling my parents and saying I wanted to go home. I thought I was trapped there. It's as though I was sort of hazy and couldn't see more than 5 feet away, and even my mother was 6 feet away. I was so ashamed of being depressed, and I just felt everybody had only terrible things to say about me. It was incredibly painful." So I won't go on and on with these. I'm going to read you just one more and then move away from these student stories. But this is someone who was actually one of my closest friends when we were in college and who had the first serious depression that I ever saw. And when she had it, I tried to understand what was happening to her. And in retrospect, I can say I didn't get it at all. But she said, "I would lie in bed singing, 'Where have all the flowers gone?' over and over to occupy my mind. I realize now that I could have had some other drugs," she had been hospitalized, "or that I could have asked someone to come and sleep in my room, but I was just too sick to think of that. I couldn't say what scared me so much, but I thought I would explode from the anxiety. I just went down and down and down and down. We kept changing medications, and I just kept going further down. I believed my doctors. I always accepted that I would get well, but I couldn't wait. I couldn't even do the next minute. I was singing to blot out the things my mind said, which were, you don't even deserve to live. You are worthless. You are never going to be anything. You're nobody." And that was when I really started thinking about killing myself. You don't think in depression that you've put on a gray veil and are seeing the world through the haze of a bad mood. You think that the veil has been taken away, the veil of happiness, and that now you're seeing truly. You try to pin the truth down and take it apart, and you think the truth is a fixed thing, but the truth is alive and it runs around. You can exorcise the demons of schizophrenics who perceive that there's something foreign inside them. But it's much harder with depressed people because we believe we are seeing the truth, but the truth lies. And I want to run for a moment with that idea of the truth lying. There is the problem in depression that you have both inaccurate perceptions and accurate perceptions, and that what changes to some extent is not the truth around you, but your relationship to that truth. So someone who's depressed might say, "No one loves me." And you can say, "Of course, you know that your dad loves you, you know that I love you," and you can counteract that. But someone who's depressed will also say, "Whatever I do in this life, ultimately I'll die," or "I'm captured alone in this body and no one can ever be truly with me." To which you have to say, "That's true, but why don't we talk about breakfast instead?" And it is this terrible problem of this very clear-sightedness, and often when I talk to depressed people, what seems extraordinary to me is not that they are so upset by those realities, but that most of us, most of the time, are not so upset by those realities. And there was a very interesting study done a few years ago in which a group of depressed and a group of non-depressed people were asked to play a video game. And after an hour, they were asked how many little monsters they thought they'd killed. And the depressed people were mostly accurate to within about 10%. And the non-depressed people mostly thought that they had killed between 15 and 20 times as many little monsters as they had actually killed. So there's this perilous accuracy to depression that makes it very, very difficult to handle. And I think that's one of the things, again, that afflicts students in particular, is their perception that what they have is not illness, but insight. And that insight is something that it's very difficult to tell them you want to treat and you want to cure. I said that I had wanted to look at models that were outside of American culture, and I wanted to look at models for treatment. I know there's been some discussion already at this conference about alternative treatments and mainstream treatments and how they relate to each other. And I have to say that I began this project as a very staunch medical conservative, and that to some extent that changed as I did the work that I was doing, because if you have brain cancer and you try an exotic form of meditation and then you say, I feel great now, you may feel great, but you probably still have brain cancer and you'll probably still die from it. But if you have depression and you try something strange and then afterwards you say, I feel great, then you are great, because depression is an illness of how you feel. And if you feel great, then you aren't depressed. The danger, it seems to me, is that people try unorthodox remedies instead of orthodox remedies because they somehow feel there's less stigma attached to them. And so while they're trying these unorthodox remedies, they get worse and worse and worse, and the depression becomes more and more intractable and more difficult to treat. So my general view is that medications and certain kinds of talking therapies have been proven and are really what's effective, but at the same time I acknowledge the possibility of doing other things. And in fact, I had one extraordinary letter from someone who wrote to me and listed she had been on 14 different medications over a period of years, and she said, I have tried all of these, none of them worked for me. I actually had ECT at one point, and I finally found the thing that helps me, and I hope you'll write about it and tell the world so it can help other people, and that is making little things from yarn. And she sent me several of them, which I'm not wearing now, but I did feel, having had this whole exchange with her, that she seemed to be feeling much better, and she seemed to feel she was happy. And so if yarn was what did it, that was fine. And also one other, I think, very illuminating anecdote, which was that in trying to understand this cross-cultural question, I traveled to West Africa, to Senegal, where I knew that there were tribal rituals for the treatment of mental illness and mental complaint. And I was very curious to see what those were and how they worked. And I had a friend with a Senegalese girlfriend, and she knew someone whose mother was a friend of the cousin of one of those lines of connection, to someone who actually performed this sort of sacred ritual, the undop, for the treatment of depression in that part of the world. And so I went off and I met with this woman and drove several hours into rural Senegal to get there from Dakar. And we had a discussion about what this ritual was and how it worked, and she was really very helpful and forthcoming. And then I said, well, you know, I'd really love to see an undop being performed. And she said, well, you seem very serious about this. I've never had a foreigner at anything of this kind, but if you want to be here, then we could certainly arrange that. And I said, that would be great. I said, when are you next doing one? And she said, I'm sure I'll do one in the next 6 months. And I said, 6 months is quite a long time for me to stay here in Rufis, waiting for that to happen. Is there any way we could expedite it? And we talked about that, and there really wasn't. And then just as I was leaving, she said, I hope you won't mind my saying this, but you don't look that great yourself. And she said, I've certainly never done this for a foreigner before, but I could conceivably perform an undop for you if you felt that would be helpful to you. So I thought, well, okay, and I said, yes, that would be great, and I was given a lot of instructions on how to prepare, and I left, and my translator turned to me and said, are you completely insane? Do you have any idea what you're getting yourself into? So I went through, in the end, this ritual, and I won't take you through all the details, but I'll tell you that the high point came when I was in the middle of a village square in a makeshift wedding bed with a ram, having blankets thrown over me, while the entire population of the village, some 400 people, danced in concentric rings around us. And then at a certain point I was pulled to my feet, my loincloth was pulled off, the ram's throat was slit, and I was covered in the blood of the freshly slaughtered ram. And this was all sort of part of the ritual. And I met a lot of people there who said that they had had these undops and that they had been wonderfully helpful to them. And I was interested by the way in which belief and the specifics of the undopp interacted. And some months later, I met with someone who was from Rwanda, and who had been working with international aid workers. And I told him a little bit about my own DUP experience, and he said, well, we do have some things that are traditionally practiced in Rwanda that are a little bit like that, and we talked about how they were the same and how they were different. And he said, you know, we have this terrible, terrible problem after the atrocities with foreign aid workers who came in to try to work on mental health. He said, and actually a lot of trouble with some Americans who were here. And I said, that's, you know, shocking, and what happened? And he said, well, they came over, they had this whole ritual thing they were doing. It did not involve being outside. It did not involve being in with the entire community acknowledging what your problem was. It did not involve having people singing or dancing, which are the things that obviously get one's blood up and flowing. He said they would do this bizarre thing. They would take people one at a time into dingy little rooms and have them talk for an hour about bad things that had happened to them. He said it made people virtually suicidal. So that's a bit on the question of alternatives. I want to turn for a moment then to the question of historical models. People tend to have the idea that depression didn't exist in any coherent form until quite recently. Actually, Hippocrates describes depression in almost exactly the terms that we would use today, and there is a long history of depression. And interestingly, as one studies the history of depression, one gets around to this question of stigma, which is, of course, one of the things that all of us face most constantly today in looking in the field of depression and depression studies. And there really was very little stigma associated with depression in the ancient world. It was seen as being kind of like dyspepsia. I mean, unfortunate and unpleasant, but there it was. That was what you had. And then St. Augustine, who has a lot to answer for, said that all illnesses were illnesses of the body or of the soul, and classed the mental illnesses as illnesses of the soul. And so it became a mark of God's disfavor to suffer from depression. And so there was suddenly this feeling that depression was terribly shameful. And then during the Spanish Inquisition, it was suggested that if you were depressed, it meant you had despaired of ultimate redemption, because if you believed in ultimate redemption, then you would not be depressed. And so people were actually imprisoned as unbelievers because they had depression. And so this whole area of stigma grew up. And it's astonishing to me to think that stigma, which was so much really born out of medieval theology, has remained so strong with us today. And I think understanding to some extent that it really has to do with these particular biases should help a little bit in lifting this notion that depression is so different from other illnesses. And I'm interested by the writing that happens now that says depression is really a physical illness, which is exactly what was being said in ancient Greece and Rome about depression in the days of Galen and, as I say, Hippocrates. I'm going to dwell just for a moment on the issue of depression among the poor. If you're basically a member of the upper middle classes and have a life which by all external standards is very pleasant, and you feel absolutely terrible all the time, then you're likely to think, well, why do I feel so bad? Perhaps I have depression. But if you have an absolutely terrible, miserable life, and you feel terrible and miserable all the time, then you're quite likely not to think that there's anything aberrant in the way you feel, that it's simply a natural reflection of your actual state. And so there are an enormous number of people who are depressed and poor and who don't know it. And it turns out, if you start to work with these populations, that it's not that they feel so bad because they have miserable lives. It's that they have miserable lives because they're depressed. Because as depressed people, they can't go out and find jobs. They can't form sort of really useful, meaningful, long-term human relationships. There are a great many things that they aren't able to do that would allow for constructive progress. And so what is needed in working with poor populations, I think, is in a way not wholly dissimilar to what's needed with depression on college campuses, where you also have people who frequently don't recognize what it is that they have, which is programs of aggressive outreach, programs in which you go to people and you try to screen them and you try to find out what's happening to them, and you say to the ones who seem to have depression, you know what, you have depression and it's treatable and this is what we can do about it. That's terribly, terribly important, and I think it's the thing that exists least in our system across a broad range of populations. To some extent now, if you acknowledge that you have depression and you go and seek help, you can get that help. There are problems with the insurance gap, there are lots of other problems, but those structures are at least more or less in place. But most people who have depression, or at least many people who have depression, don't know that's what they have. They don't know it's an illness, they don't know it has a name, and they don't know it has a treatment. And those are the people to whom I think we need most to reach out. Among the poor, I was astonished by the results I saw in an outreach program that was conducted by an academic who was going into public health clinics and screening people and then doing just that, saying to some of them, you have depression, I'd like to treat you. And most of the people to whom she said it said, I have a lot of, I can't do that. And she was very insistent and very forceful. And I was astonished by the changes that she was able to bring about in the lives of the women, with women whom she was working with. And I found it incredibly moving and incredibly compelling. And there was one woman I met who, when I met her, was absolutely emaciated. She had been so depressed that she wasn't eating. She was suffering from malnutrition. She had had quite a terrible and traumatized life. She was married to a husband who was both physically and verbally abusive. She had ended up with 12 children, 8 of her own and 4 of his who were living with them. She was totally overwhelmed by that, as well one might be, and she was terrified of trying to deal with the children. She said her husband would go out and the children would go to school, and she would crawl under the bed because it was the only place she felt safe. She said, and 3 o'clock would come when the children came home, and it just came so fast, and when they came home, all I wanted was to die. She said, and I didn't know what to take, so I just took as much aspirin and Tylenol as I could, anything to try to stop the pain, but none of it worked. And then she was brought into a treatment program in which she was given some really very straightforward treatment, some medications and some group therapy. And this is 18 months later, after she had had treatments, which, by the way, really came to a total cost of only a few $100s. She said, oh, and I should also add that when she was ill, she had not been able to work, and so she had not had a job. When she began to get better, she got a job working for the U.S. Navy in childcare. My kids are so much happier. They want to do things all the time now. We talk hours every day, and they're my best friends. As soon as I come in the door, I put my jacket down, purse, and we just get out books and read, doing homework all together and everything. We joke around. We all talk about careers, and before they didn't even think careers. My eldest wants to go to the Air Force. One wants to be a firefighter, one a preacher, and one of the girls is going to be a lawyer. I talk to them about drugs, and they keep clean now. They don't cry like they used to, and they don't fight like they did. I let them know they can talk to me about anything. There's one room in the new place for the boys, and one for the girls, and one for me. But they all just like to get up on my bed with me, and we're all sitting around there at night. That's all I need now is my kids. I never thought I would get this far. It feels good to be happy. I don't know how long it's going to last, but I sure hope it's forever. And things keep on changing. The way I dress, the way I look, the way I act, the way I feel. I'm not afraid anymore. I can walk out the door not being afraid. I don't think those bad feelings are coming back. And if it weren't for the doctor and that, I'd still be at home under the bed, if I was still alive at all. I prayed to the Lord to send me an angel, and he heard my prayers. I found it incredibly compelling, and I was struck by how important this issue of outreach was, as I say, among the poor, among the young, and really across the general population. And so I went to Congress, and I had meetings with Pete Domenici and with the late Paul Wellstone, who have both done so much for the cause of mental health and have fought so hard to try to improve the situation in insurance for mental health. And Domenici said to me, and I proposed that it would serve not only the humanitarian advantage of the country to treat these people, but also the economic advantage. I mean, here was someone who was living on welfare with children who, in fact, had been headed into the juvenile delinquency system, and after she had been through this experience, she had a job, and they were talking about being lawyers and going into the mainstream. And Domenici said to me, I believe that what you're saying is true, that it would serve the economic and the humanitarian purposes of this country to offer these programs of outreach. But he said there are really a number of reasons why it's not going to happen. The first is that for us to do anything at the federal level would involve issuing mandates. And this is a Congress which is very resistant to mandates, particularly in the field of health care. The second is that we live on a line item budget. And while it may be the case that over the long term these programs would help people with somatic illness not to go into hospitals, would help people on welfare to get back to work, would help the children of depressed mothers to get out of the prison system, we can't this year take money out of welfare or prison or public health in order to put it into a program for outreach to people who are depressed. He said, and the third thing is that it's really a very long-term project, and you're dealing with people who have to work in terms of short-term returns. And then Wellstone said something which was so touching and so astonishing to me, which was, he said, you know, we live in a representative democracy, and in a representative democracy, the voters have a voice on Capitol Hill. And the people who are depressed, by and large, on election day, they're at home with the covers pulled over their heads. They're not in the polling places, and they aren't casting their votes. And so they don't have any representation here on Capitol Hill. There are a number of people here today who have been very much involved in efforts to lobby the government and to bring about changes in mental health care. But as Wellstone said, unless you can get the people who are sufficiently together to be able to come down and make appeals directly to Congress to do that, and cause public pressure to be built, and get the articles written that cause public awareness to grow, he said you won't be able to do anything, because what you're describing is in some senses the ultimate disenfranchised group. I'm going to conclude by going back to some of the people I talked about at the beginning and trying to address that question of the relationship between personality and illness. It seems to me in the end that people who are extremely depressed and try to block that depression out of their minds and their consciousness and try never to think about it and never to return to it are ironically the ones who are most consistently afflicted by it. So I meet people who sort of say, yes, I was depressed, but that was a while ago and it's over with. Depression is a chronic illness. It requires ongoing treatment. It requires ongoing attention. In addition to requiring the kind of specific treatment that comes from medications, it involves a reconception of yourself and a new understanding of who you are that incorporates the idea that you've been depressed, that incorporates the idea of whatever kind of treatment you're taking, that puts together in some synthetic form a new self that can go on in the world dealing with, not free from usually, but dealing with the fact of depression. So the people who try to close themselves off to it and say, that was weird, that was aberrant, that's not who I am, I want nothing more to do with it, tend to end up really being the ones who are, as I say, not necessarily the worst in terms of symptoms, but the worst in terms of their ability to be in the world. The people who are willing to look into the depression and try to find a peaceful and permanent relationship with it are the ones, it seems to me, who are best able to keep going and to move forward. Which is not to say that depressions are great and everyone should have one. It's to say that if you have a depression, there are many things that you can learn from it in many ways in which it changes your life. And if you've been saddled with that, you should have the ability to respond to it, and you should strive to make some kind of sense out of it. And I'm going to read you a couple of passages from the people I described to you a few minutes ago. The guy who described being given Valium when he was a freshman in college said, the most important, and who is now a publisher, said, the most important theme in my work is redemption. I still don't know my role in things. I'm drawn to stories of saints and martyrs. I don't think I can endure what they have gone through. I'm not ready to set up a hospice in India, but depression put me on the right course. I might meet people and I know that they don't have the level of experience that I have. The fact that I got through such a catastrophic illness has permanently changed my interior landscape. I was always drawn to faith and to goodness, but I wouldn't have had the drive, the moral purpose, without the breakdowns, even if they sometimes happen now. And the woman who described studying in the bathroom said, mood is another frontier, like deep ocean or deep space. Having so much low mood gives you mettle. I think I deal with difficult losses better than most other people because I have so much experience of the feelings they entail. Depression isn't an obstacle in my path. It's a sort of part of me that I carry along down the path, and I believe that it's supposed to help me at various points. How? That I don't know, but I believe in my depression, in its redemptive power, nonetheless, for all the horror. I'm a very strong woman, and that's partly because of the depression. And the woman who described singing "Where Have All the Flowers Gone" said, "I used to get nervous a lot, and I would just talk and talk and talk. And then I started volunteering at an AIDS residence. They had teas there, and I was supposed to help get the tea and cake and juice for the patients, and to sit with them and chat, because many of them didn't have people to visit them and were lonely. I remember one day early on, I sat down with some people and tried to kick off a conversation by asking them what they'd done for their 4th of July. They told me, but they just weren't keeping up their end of the conversation at all. I thought, this is not very friendly or helpful of them. And then it hit me. These guys aren't going to make small talk. In fact, after those first brief answers, they weren't going to talk at all. But they didn't want me to leave. So I decided, I'm here with them, and I'm going to be with them. It's simply going to be an occasion when I'm a person who doesn't have AIDS and doesn't look really sick and isn't dying, but who can tolerate the fact that they do and they are. And so I just stayed with them that afternoon without talking. The loving is that you are there, simply paying attention, unconditionally. If suffering is what the person is doing right then, that's what they're doing. You're being with that, not trying like crazy to do something about it. I've learned how to do that. I'm able to just be there with people because of the stuff I've needed from people. I've learned to give the things I need. In fact, our needs are our greatest assets. I know that in the wake of my own depression, I have a much greater sense of the joy of everyday life when I'm not depressed, that I have a sense of how intense emotion can be and how overpowering it can be, that I think I'm more humane in my interactions with people and at least a little bit less arrogant. I have a sense really of having changed my perspective on the world. And people say to me, well, if you had it to do over, would you be depressed? And my immediate response is, of course not. But at another level, I feel as though I wouldn't be who I am now without having gone through the depression. And while I hated it, and I've had various recurrences, and whenever they occur, I think, how can I insanely stand up in front of people and say there was strength in this horrible experience? It's nothing but barren emptiness. Still, when I have the experience, I know within it that there are certain strengths to be derived from it, and that I have had over time to develop both an understanding of how to be best treated physically and to find the best psychopharmacologist and get on the best medications and stick with those medications and not try to go off them and have some kind of foolish idea that the brain will have miraculously turned into someone else's brain while I was taking them. But at the same time, to have done that other work, which is the work of coming to terms with the fact of depression. And I think, in conclusion, that when we look at college campuses, we have to provide help on all of those fronts. We have to be able to help students to understand that they have depression, to get the acute treatment they need, and to help them at that early stage when identity is still so much in flux, to formulate personalities that incorporate the depression and allow them to tolerate it. Because at least for the time being, if you can tolerate it well, you're doing okay. And if you can't tolerate it, there's nothing to be done about it. Thank you very much. I've done a certain amount of work on depression in England, and the sort of shortest answer I can give is if you're going to be depressed, do it here. The sense of stigma is still much higher in England. It's much more of an pull yourself up by your bootstraps society. It's also, I'm a great believer in expanding the situation in healthcare right now, but because of the way that certain protocols have been written in England, people tend to be started on medications that are more difficult to take than the ones they get here. So just in that purely technical sense, people are being started, for example, on MAOIs, which have lots of complications attached to them, rather than SSRIs, the sort of more modern drugs, which is the class that Prozac belongs to. But in general, what struck me most is the closeness of the society. And I had an experience, also written about in the book, when I was spending a weekend at someone's house, and there were a number of other people there. And one of the days that I was there, the first day, I guess, a woman took me aside and she said, you know, I've suffered from depression, but I really don't discuss it with anyone, and I don't want anyone to know, and please, my husband wouldn't understand it, it's a woman's thing, but I'm taking such and such a medication, what do you think? And so we discussed that. That was Friday. On Sunday, this woman's husband took me aside. And he said to me, I don't really discuss this with people because I don't want my wife to know. She'd think I was less of a man, but, you know, I've had this depression and it's really been kind of an issue, and I'm taking... And they were taking the same medication and hiding it in 2 different places in the same bedroom. And I thought, that is so British to be sort of doing that and to not have any of that openness and intimacy. And I feel as though there are many relationships in Britain that are broken down by that. So it's a less open society. More, I think, the way our society was 20 or 30 years ago. But there are certainly some excellent people working in the field in England. And for those who do avail themselves of the better end of the health spectrum, you know, there are fantastic clinicians, there's fantastic research. I mean, there's some very good stuff there. Anyone else? Yes.
Would you have us leave with the impression today that anyone who's had a verifiable depressive state, had depression, cannot on their own rise above it without intervention?
If I understand you correctly, the question is whether someone can rise above depression without intervention?
Correct.
Right. I think that rising above depression or getting through depression or whatever sort of turn of phrase one wants to use for this is always a matter of cooperation between external intervention and internal determination. I mean, people often say to me, you know, people should just be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and I say, no, actually not. But people also tend these days, I think in part because of public perceptions of how antidepressants work, to say, well, I'll just take the medicine and I'll wait until I get better. And you have to actually try as hard as you can, which when you're really depressed is not very hard, but you have to commit yourself to trying to pull through. And there has to be a cooperation between will and treatment. Now, there are some people, depression is cyclical, so by and large, you come out of the depression with time, whether you have treatment or not. And possibly if you've had an acute episode triggered by external circumstances, you'll stay out for quite a long time. So there are some people who wait out their depression and then manage at least for a while without any kind of treatment, and then maybe wait out the next one. But I often get into a discussion with people who sort of seem to think that's better somehow. In the first place, as I think John probably said earlier, repeated depressive episodes cause lesions in the hippocampus, and sitting them out is not such a great idea. Treating them is actually a lot better for your brain. In the second place, this notion that there's a natural way and an artificial way seems to me completely contrived. I mean, the natural way would be for us not to brush our teeth, and then they'd fall out by the time we were 25 years old. And so I think there are all kinds of interventions that one engages in. I think people frequently also have some kind of insane idea that, not insane, I don't mean to disparage it, but people suffer under the illusion that if you have depression and you decide to sit it out and you decide you're not going to have any external intervention, and as I say, the external thing can be any of a broad range of things, but people have the idea that if you sit it out and you have 5 bad years, that somehow you'll get those years back. That at the end you'll have had those years and there'll be space and room for you then to have a rich and fulfilling life. But actually, 5 years of being withdrawn uses up those 5 years and leaves a shadow of damage that goes through the rest of your life. So my advice to people is always to deal with this as expeditiously as possible. And then just finally, depression, the earlier you catch it, the easier it is to treat. So lots of people sort of say, well, I just think I'll get through this on my own. And they don't seek treatment. I myself didn't originally seek treatment until much later than I should have. And I wouldn't possibly have had a book to write, but I also wouldn't have had these sort of difficult experiences if I had responded more expediently and had dealt with things more quickly. Yes?
You discussed the issue of conversion of funding for treatment of persons with psychiatric disease. And when the limit on psychiatric disease is so low, $250,000 as opposed to $1 million for other massive diseases, if we start that early, and when we start working with persons who are poor, who already don't have insurance, and where the stigma is even greater when these kids enter the mainstream. In your opinion, what would you suggest for a group like this in terms of what they can do? Because maybe the persons who are depressed don't vote, but possibly some of the people in here do. And what kinds of things would you recommend that these people can in terms of bringing about a different level or a higher level of care for persons who are depressed?
I think there are a number of lobbying groups who are doing effective work on the subject of mental illness. And the question was about what one should do to try to bring about change. You know, I wish I had some sort of brilliant original idea. Write your congressman. Try to get media out there. Found a depression center at a major university that's really addressing these issues. That's part of what I think one needs to do. I mean, the problem is very difficult. The problem, I think, of getting any kind of health care for less advantaged populations is, I mean, just overall an incredible problem. I think at the moment, though, one of the things that needs to be done, there's a terrible divide between what seems to me to be clinically useful and politically useful. Clinically, I think it's most useful to say that biology and emotion are really all part of the same thing. That if you change the chemistry of someone's brain through drugs, that will change the way they feel. And if you change the way they feel, not only through psychotherapy, but even through something like education, then you change the structure of their brain. And so there isn't really a distinction, and some of the pure biological models are a little bit deceptive. But having said that, for political purposes, the most useful thing is to come up with the most strictly biological answer. If you can say to a congressman, look at these two brain pictures, this one which is gray is a depressed person, and this one which is pink is a happy person, even given that those colorings are usually artificial, then that will make an enormous difference to people. So I think we all face this difficulty of the political agenda and the clinical agenda, and that reconciling them is very difficult. And so far as care for the poor goes, I mean, I think, as always, the way to get better care for the poor is to educate people who are wealthier and liberal and who will then advocate for the poor. Yes?
You began and ended with personality. Could you say a bit more about what a personality is?
The question of what a personality is. That's a big question. I think a personality is someone's whole way of interacting with the world. The ways in which someone is strong, the ways in which someone is weak, the places in which someone finds happiness, the way that one is perceived by and communicates oneself to other people. I feel like I could go on for about an hour and 20 minutes trying to talk about what a personality is. I mean, I'm also a novelist and spend a lot of time trying to capture personalities in prose, but I think some people are naturally inclined to some behaviors and other people are naturally inclined to other behaviors, and that what kind of personality you have has a great deal to do with how you act in the world. And I think that personality, though it is in some ways fixed, also has a certain fluidity attached to it. Yeah. The role of creativity in the process of recovering from depression. There's a great deal said about the idea that depression is a creative state. And people often say to me, well, you know, I'm an artist and so I have to sort of stay in my depression. And there are people I know who are journalists who feel that they have to stay in Iraq also. I mean, it's a choice that people make. I think essentially the depression itself is a very non-constructive, unproductive state. But I think one sees and learns things in the course of the depression that can inform art afterwards. But the general issue of creativity for people who are not necessarily trying to make art for the generations, but just to express themselves, is terribly important. Because part of what happens when you're depressed is that you feel isolated, and you feel closed down, and you feel as though no one understands what's happening to you, and you have no vocabulary for explaining any of what's happening to you. And so I think if you're able in a depression to begin to describe things, that makes a world of difference. And it makes a world of difference for a number of reasons, one of which is that it gives you some feeling of control. The other one of which is that it mitigates your sense of aloneness. And the last of which is that it makes you feel as though you're capable of doing something in a period when you feel paralyzed. When I was at my most depressed, I certainly couldn't write a word. But as I began to come out of depression, I did write a lot. And most of what I wrote was completely uninteresting to anyone but me, and certainly isn't in the book. But the process of writing it down made me feel better, and the process of making music or other kinds of art can be very important to people in terms of regaining a sense of themselves. I think your sense of yourself in a social environment is predicated on your expressive abilities. Yes?
In your research, have you done anything with nutrition, and the impact that they may have on the chemical balance or imbalance?
Question is about nutrition and depression. I think when people talk to me about sort of high rates of depression, that the first thing to look at are always the organic issues. Are you getting enough sleep on a regular basis? People say, why is there so much depression in America right now? There are many reasons, but one is that people on average sleep 2 hours less than they did before the invention of television. So sleep. Are you exercising? Exercise makes a huge difference. And the other is nutrition. And I won't go into the specifics of what nutrients are important in what ways. There are other people more qualified to do that than I am. But having a regular balanced diet, keeping your blood sugar at an appropriate level, not sort of binging or starving, all of those things make an enormous difference in your recovery. I've been told we're out of time, so I'm going to have to stop there. But thank you all very much again.